Hey, it's Sol with another video, brought to you by Rethqual Landscaping. Even the impending apocalypse can have a balanced energy. Sometime after you pick up the Battle for Azeroth expansion, you land in Kul'Tiraz or Zandalar, you'll get to max level, and the game will open up to a barrage of content to complete, gear to farm, and enemies to slaughter. Just like the previous expansion, and the one before, and before, and before, and before, the unconscious questions will be asked. What's different in this expansion's version of Endgame? Is it going to be good? And how long until we get bored? Today we're going to dive in and identify the content and then analyze the always subjective questions. I'll provide the info, while your conclusions may vary and are likely to disagree with my own. That's what makes this fun. We're still in the beta, so there's still stuff that could change, but we're at a stage where we have a pretty good idea of what the endgame experience will be like. So let's get started and blast off at the speed of light. Let's start with what's familiar with us as we begin our journey at max level. The Legion formula should be familiar to you, so I'll just brush on this really quick. We'll unlock world quests and get a cool Flightmaster whistle. There are reps to grind and a Pathfinder meta to power through. We'll complete a separate war campaign that opens up the opposite faction's continent. There are mission tables that'll drive that, and to eventually rebuild our great gold empire. There's still dungeons and arenas and battlegrounds to gear up in, and later, raids and Mythic Plus. Titan Forging is still going to be a thing, but the new azerite gear will stay out of that system. On a side note, this still threatens the gear grind at higher levels of play, but we've yet to see a full statement from Blizzard about changes to Titan Forging, other than that it got out of hand and they want it toned down. So if you're holding a pitchfork, keep holding it for now at least. Now let's get to what's different. One is a pretty big difference, in fact, it's the size of a zone. There is no Suramar-like zone, really. So far, this has been a talking point, forwarding a critique that there's so little to do at max level because there's no Suramar-like zone, but I'm going to provide one counterpoint. I'm speculating here, but based on what I've observed from forums and guildmates and my own experience, while Suramar's campaign was terrific, it wasn't something I enjoyed doing more than once, let alone multiple times. I get that I didn't have to do it on alt unless I wanted to be a completionist, which is why I didn't do it on alts. But looking now at how BFA's war campaign is going to be delivered, I think Blizzard understands that sentiment. After all, Suramar was a max level only zone that could be entirely skipped after later endgame zones came about. But that goes into a different critique in game design philosophy, and I'm just gonna move on. Instead of a zone that players would just gloss over, Blizzard instead, I'm speculating that Blizzard instead is taking those efforts and spreading it over content that is still optional, but is less likely to be skipped over because we're sidestepping an entire zone. So theoretically, we might see multiple war campaigns, or additional quest chains, and, development across the entire expansion, and not just front-loaded at the very beginning. That's where both my fascinations and my fears kick in. As someone who primarily plays as the Horde, all of Kul'Tiraz becomes additional content at max level, but the trade-off is that at the moment, the war campaign limits the chance to familiarize myself with the other continents. Our home continents offer a rich, maybe even an overwhelming questing experience, and by comparison, once we dive into the other side, it feels kind of barren, apart from all those world quests. It makes me wonder if Blizzard will do a better job of delivering a consistent experience with, for example, multiple war campaigns as the expansion goes on, or if there's going to be a repeat of the Broken Shore. Also missing so far will be solo content such as Wither Training, the Deaths of Chromie scenario, and the Mage Tower challenges. If it turns out that these will never come, I'll be pretty bummed out. These features were a bit contentious, but I think it's a fun thing that got a lot of attention from players. Alright, let's get to some changes and additions here. PvPers out there will have a different experience than the typical routine. From a progression standpoint, obtaining gear should feel a little bit more predictable. Gear will still drop at random from arenas and battlegrounds, but there will also be a weekly goal to acquire a piece of gear and eventually build a complete set. This system shares similarities with earlier conquest catch-up mechanisms, so you shouldn't fall behind. Also, a new system of PvP brackets hopes to also give clear and meaningful upgrades for rated PvPers. Outdoors is where the bigger changes are going to take place. Replacing the smaller pockets of open PvP in Legion will be a toggle into War Mode, which is game-wide. War Mode will separate open-world PvPers and non-PvPers, giving access to additional features to spice up world PvP. The current examples include a lootable chest that the factions will fight to claim, and an assassin/bounty system to encourage continuous conflict. On top of that is a scaling system for both level and item level, meant to narrow the gap between opposing players and keep overgearing in the outdoor world from getting too out of hand. The best way to describe this mode is with an anecdote from my time on the beta. I was wandering around a zone when I got a whisper from someone asking me to join their group. They wanted to kill an assassin on the map. I agreed, grouped up with them, and made our way over to the assassin's location, and we defeated other players on the way there. By the time we got to the assassin and took him out, we were in a brawl with numerous other players, both in and out of party and from the opposing faction, and this is partially because some of us became assassins in the meantime, making us a really tempting target. My understanding of Blizzard's intent is to reward world PvP with something more than conquest or gold, which is what you do in fact get. But it's also to reward PvPers with more fighting, and those brief moments of prestige where people in the zone know your name and want to add it to the list. BFA introduces azerite gear, which, without over-explaining what the system is an additional gear meta to go alongside with secondary stats. Depending on your class and spec, there's going to be a certain combination of dungeon, rep, and raid gear that you want because of some awesome bonuses, synergies, or both. On a quick side note, the only rep that presumably drops azerite-based gear at the moment is the Champions of the Azeroth faction. Thought you should know that. Anyway, there's a reasonable chance that you may discover and obtain multiple builds that'll work for you. But it's more likely that your rotten luck has led you to a suboptimal build that nonetheless you should probably complete, as opposed to having an amalgamation of nothing. This, in my opinion, is the great grind of the Battle for Azeroth, fueled almost entirely by your interest in what amounts to collecting procs and ability enhancements for your character. I'll get into the grind a little bit later. Behind this gear farming is the Heart of Azeroth, which will let you access these azerite traits. But when considering this and the way that you'll be farming for gear, this grind is going to feel quite different than it did in Legion, and more like how it was in previous expansions. Here's how I chose to understand it at the time. Legion farming was like a race, with a blindfold on. You took the most efficient route to acquire anything, in the hopes that among those hundreds of drops, the bad luck protection would kick in, and you get a legendary or a Titanforge piece of gear. At worst, you got enough of that essence to buy another slot machine token, and hope for the best there too. In the meantime, you would pump artifact power or AP tokens into the specs that you plan to use. The Battle for Azeroth has you paying a bit closer attention to the Mythic Plus dungeon you want to farm, or what Raid Finder wing to repeat. It feels like it's going to leave players feeling a little bit more selective. AP grinding in Legion, at least the way I saw it, didn't feel like much of a thing, but I get it when critics complained about the grind early on. But AP and BFA won't feel the same way as it did at the beginning of Legion. Global artifact knowledge gains are coming back, and the Heart of Azeroth is a single artifact that works with all of your specs. No more AP tokens are hanging out in your inventory, no more having to switch specs to make sure AP goes into the right place. I don't consider this dumbed down, it's just simplified to what many players and critics wish this always was. Another way to see the AP grind is that the strength of your Heart of Azeroth is directly relative to the power of the other azerite pieces you own. I'll elaborate. If the gear that you have only has a maximum Heart of Azeroth level requirement of 10, the grind for artifact power is still going to be there, but it's going to almost abruptly end at level 10. Excess farming is going to be discouraged by the fact that all you get for your trouble is a small stat increase in your necklace, which is a far cry from the raw percentage increases in life and damage during Legion. You can grind to stay ahead of the game when you inevitably get azerite gear upgrades, but that's entirely your choice. That's why I like to think of AP not as artifact power, but as armor proficiency. The goalpost is going to be set by my highest level azerite pieces. This makes the AP grind dependent on your style of play. For those who participate in the highest level of play, as in Mythic Raiding or high level Mythic Plus, the grind is at its greatest because the gear is probably a little bit ahead of what the knowledge level is at the time. Going down from there, the grind may be significantly relaxed. This can bring up some interesting questions from high-level players who may choose to use lower-level azerite gear because their artifact hasn't quite caught up yet. But I kind of like that so far, that the grind has a direct relationship to the content and the gear that we obtain. As for the AP grind itself, island expeditions are meant to be the most efficient way to farm this stuff, but I'll give you more on that later. The great boon or burden of the azerite system is that with every content release after launch, the system will become deeper. With each new world boss, dungeon, or raid, as well as a new tier of content, the meta might change. It won't just be the tweaking and rebalancing of traits in part of Blizzard that's going to be disruptive, but with new traits that are introduced that may synergize with older gear previously acquired from Mythic Plus dungeons. Thankfully, because Azerite gear can't Titan Forge, it's more likely that players will shift from one raid tier's gear to the next while updating relevant dungeon gear, but that's not a sure guarantee, and there's still all the non-Azerite gear to consider which can Titan Forge. But again, we'll have to wait and see what our expectations will be for that system. Alright, let's get to the brand new stuff, with Island Expeditions, which are a brand new feature coming to BFA that's centered on acquiring Azerite and destroying your enemies who are also trying to farm it. It's a 3-player activity and role agnostic, as in there's no tank nor healer required, so queues should be quick. In their place will be different power-ups on the island, as well as consumables to help you get along. From developer interviews so far, we've learned that the most efficient way to farm for AP will be through Island Expeditions, and these take anywhere between 15 and 25 minutes to complete. Without getting into too much detail, they are fairly fun, and they deliver a different experience each time, even if the formula is typically the same. The effectiveness of Island Expeditions, though, will ultimately come from how efficient or inefficient other Azerite sources are. I explained earlier that the need to power up the Heart of Azeroth is mostly dependent on the Azerite gear that we have. So this reveals a weakness in Island Expeditions as a whole, that later in a given tier, and especially late in the expansion, there won't be a whole lot of reasons to run them continuously unless rewards are continuously added. Now on to Warfronts, which I personally find to be in a more awkward place when it comes to progression. The reward system behind Warfronts isn't yet entirely known as of this recording, but one surefire thing is that completing the Warfronts will unlock a world boss and maybe other world quests in the area. In this case, Arathi Highlands. So there's a chance for loot from this particular raid boss, but at least at the moment, in the face of the many ways to farm for gear, Warfronts don't appear to be one of them. It remains to be seen whether or not the cosmetic rewards tied to Warfronts are just that, or if this gear will have stats and Azerite traits attached to them. All in all though, while the Warfront activity is fun to be a part of, it feels like any reward system attached to it is a bit out of place. Almost to the point where I question its priority in the battle for Azeroth. Legion had some really big wins with systems like world quests and mythic keystone dungeons that have a lot of longevity. At the moment, I don't see the same formula in this first foray into Warfront or Island Expeditions, but that's when we look at it from a gearing and progression standpoint, and that isn't everything for every player. The World of Warcraft is a very gear-centric game that still has a big focus on delivering a worthwhile gameplay experience. Does the battle for Azeroth deliver? BFA is being pretty daring by introducing new game modes into the mix with Warfronts and Island Expeditions, making this an expansion with a lot of different things to do. I said that for those of us who are big into gear progression quickly, that these features might fall off in favor of something more efficient, like maybe Mythic Plus. On the flip side, what makes these game modes universally attractive is the dynamic and role-agnostic approach. Island Expeditions can be completed regardless of there being a tank or a healer, thanks to numerous power-ups and purchasable consumables. Warfronts is being sold as an epic experience for 20 players, again, regardless of role. As an example, I can hop into a Warfront and do nothing but farm resources and use them to upgrade and send out troops without so much as use a single ability. And from my Warfront testing, that can be a very effective approach. To round things up, I think that overall, Blizzard is hitting the marks with this start of this battle for Azeroth. There are a few lessons for them to learn from Legion that I think have been addressed. One is alt friendliness. The artifact is class-wide, features like Island Expeditions are account-wide as soon as they're unlocked, and Honor is a global experience system similar to Diablo 3's Paragon system. The open RNG system of legendaries has been pretty much replaced with the mapping out of this Azerite meta. With how complex the system can get, I'm glad that this gear is targeted and not burdened by Titan forging. PvP sounds so chaotic and disruptive that it'll be the most violent and masochistic players that are going to participate in war mode, and I find that to be totally fine. To those who are worried that BFA will have long content drought, I say don't worry because, well, there probably will be. WoW isn't made for just me, or for you. It's made for everyone, which has both its boon and burden. The new features coming in the battle for Azeroth are fun, but there's a lot of questions left to be answered, like if PvP balancing will work out, what's Titan forging going to be like this time around, and will Azerite traits be interesting enough to farm for? But that's for another day. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in a comment below. Consider supporting the channel as a patron so I can give you more of this and all things Warcraft. And I'm working on other awesome perks for patrons other than the shoutouts and feeling good about themselves. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay breezy.